I'm Ben Rich. I'm, as I say, in think tank. We are focused on complex uh, systems, including the financial system, and we're interested, frankly, in not just coming up with one or two clever wheezes, which hopefully might improve the financial system, but we reckon for them to work and to not have unintended consequences, you need to understand the thing as a whole. This topic of our today's discussion seemed to fit very nicely within that. Can I ask just a couple of housekeeping points? Please, once we start, if you would turn off your cameras and mute yourself, at least for the opening part of the discussion. And I will hand over to Vicky, who's going to take through and chair. Vicky really doesn't need any introduction by this stage, other than to say that she is the chair of our fellows and brilliant at identifying interesting topics and interesting speakers for these webinars, which is why they are so much improved over the last few months since she became our chair of fellows. So thank you, Vicky.
Thank you.
One of the UK's most eminent economists, and she is going to lead us through our discussion on the history of business, or the business of history, and what we can learn from it. Vicky, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this introduction. Now, the way we're going to do it is that I will ask Tom to say a few words, and then I'll ask about his new book, which is absolutely brilliant and incredibly nicely done, if I may say so. The Business of History, such a lovely volume, and with easy to read and really full of very useful information about businesses, how they were in the past, and the ones that survived, what they had in common. And then we're going to get John to respond briefly. Now, John Kay, Professor Sir John Kay, spoke to us about the corporation of the 21st century. So for those who had missed it, we're getting more or less, 2 for 1. It's one of those things that are now becoming very commonplace in terms of encouraging people to buy. And we've encouraged you all to come this evening and listen to this webinar that we're carrying out, which gives me great pleasure, because I've known Tom and John, but I've known Tom for quite some time. Of course, he's an ex-MP, and he has written quite a lot of books on business, and he's a co-founder also of Fair for You, which is the ethical lending social enterprise. So the interesting thing for me about this book is that you've gone back, Tom, to look at the companies that were, seminal, if you like, in their time, and those that have survived through the centuries, or at least one century, and what the defining characteristics were of those. And I think this is really important because, of course, we were talking with John about how businesses are run right now, and whether we do understand the corporation in the 21st century, and how things perhaps have changed and what we need to be watching out for. So we thought that this would be a nice compliment to have the two of you talk about this evening. And then I will ask some questions so that you all know how it works, those who haven't been on these events before, of Tom, and John perhaps can come back as well. And then we'll open it up, because a number of you have already sent some pre-questions. I may or may not ask those. I may forget to do so because I had some difficulty joining because I'm in a different environment. Those who know me well will realize I don't have the bookcases behind me, so I'm somewhere else. But hopefully I can find all the questions that were there. But also we'll encourage you all, making it more interactive, to unmute yourselves and open up your screens as well, so we can see you if you wanted to ask a question. You don't have to if you don't. And then we will take it from there, and I will be your chair and see what happens. And at the end, when we get near to the end, Ben will come and tell us that the time is up and we need to finish the conversation. So, Tom, if I can come to you and ask you what it is that urged you to write this book, because you were doing quite a lot of research, of course, on businesses more generally. What you found, because it looks like you've based a lot of it on a publication you found of someone who had written about some of those companies that we're going to be talking about, and what the conclusions of that are. So over to you, but you've only got 7 minutes.
7 minutes, right. The only point I'd take issue there, Vicky, is with the business about companies that succeeded, because William Lever, who was one of the entrepreneurs that I looked at, said right from the very beginning it was far more interesting to look at those businesses that failed and to learn from them. But just to give you an idea of where I come from in all this, I was a Labour MP, as you said, from 97 to 2010. And up until this day, I have never worked or never been employed by the private sector. And I'm not an economist. I'm a biologist. So it's interesting taking what I think is a bit of a fresh look at these things. And of course, I had all those sort of prejudices in my politics that, of course, the state sector was going to be the one that actually delivered progress and good and everything. But I got sort of sadly disillusioned, and the crash of 2008 was certainly part of that. But by then, a company in my constituency, going by the name of Nestle, had said to me, come and see what we do in the community. And they took me and a couple of colleagues to South Africa for a week. And I was overwhelmed by what I saw. It was a business case for investing in communities, a business case for helping people live longer. And that got me fascinated. And when the crash came, it was obviously we needed to have all hands to the tiller, as it were. And I set myself up as a consultant, and I had various big names. Principally, the biggest one with the longest period of time I worked was on the Boots Sustainability and Responsibility Committee. And as you say, I wrote a number of words as we went along. And it was all about really investigating the power of, well, I call it using the tools of business to create public good. And by the tools of business, what I'm saying is that capitalism is almost value free. It can be regarded as a toolbox. You can use those tools for maximizing profit, or you can use the tools for doing good, or you can blend the two in between. As you mentioned, I co-founded a social enterprise, which is all about that. It's about using those business tools and generating a positive outcome. And during the course, probably of researching my previous book, The Company Citizen, I came across this. This is Romance of Great Business by W.H. Beable. And I saw a copy online on Amazon for £600. I thought I must have that, but not from Amazon. So I went to the secondhand books websites, and I got this one for £6. And it evidently spent a lot of its life on the shelves of Norwich Public Library. And what
sorry, Tom, because there were only a few copies that were published, isn't that right?
I imagine, well, only a few copies surviving, because it was published in 1925. Only a few copies surviving, indeed. And it was...
A latte to go, please. A latte to go, thanks.
Sorry.
No, a latte.
Yeah, you need to switch your voice. No, but what I meant, Tom, is that you did say that it was a self-publication. Is that right? And there were only about maybe 300 copies?
I don't know how many made copies, but the publisher was Heath Cranton, and Heath Cranton did appear to be self-publishing, a self-publishing house. However, Frances Burnett, the Secret Garden, she published through them as well. And Beable had other books out with other publishers at other times.
Right.
But what he'd written was essentially 30 love letters. So it's 32 love letters to companies of the time. But he'd missed out so many things, so particularly the negative side. How can you talk about Bryant and May without the Match Girls? How can you talk about Horrocks Textiles without the Preston Lockout? And so on. How can you talk about Lever Brothers, as it was, without mentioning the Congo? So all of these things were missing from there, and there was no analysis either. So I redid the research, and to be fair, I had probably better access to research than Beable had 100 years ago because of the internet and so on. And I then did an analysis, looked for patterns, and some of those patterns were quite surprising.
So to explain for a second, he had taken a few companies, a number of companies, and he sort of followed them about what the characteristics were, didn't he? Yeah. Yes.
But as I say, they were love letters. They weren't critical. They weren't analytical. They were the biggest in the world, the best in the world, the longest established. It was almost every story has a superlative in it at some point. And I decided not only to do that work again, but to then bring it up to date. And some of the patterns that I found in his work were, for example, the entrepreneurs were the left-wingers of the day. And they were not the Church of England establishment people of the day. They were, obviously, you expect to find Quakers in there, but something like 80% of all the entrepreneurs were nonconformists, and something like 80% were liberals as well. And many of the families were represented in Parliament as liberals. Only two were conservatives, as I recall, and one of those was a liberal at heart, and that was W.H. Smith, who wanted to be a Liberal MP, but they wouldn't let him join the Reform Club, so he stood as a Tory. And then became, of course, the ruler of the Queen's Navy, as we know. And then I sort of wrote the book through an ESG lens, and ESG, of course, wasn't round at the time. G was, but didn't get covered by laws and regulations till into the 20th century. S was, but never got spoken about. We see William Hartley, the jam man, being the best employer of women, paid women far more than anybody else in his community did. And E, of course, the environment, not mentioned at all. So when I tracked the companies since over the last 100 years, that analysis was stood out in a sense. And are we seeing Dennis's ear again?
I'm afraid so. And he was making a noise before, which is quite unusual for someone's anatomy, but there we are.
I think the final point is to say that only 4 of those companies still exist in their original form. Unilever, which has been Unilever since 1929, BP, because it's been sort of stuck in public ownership for most of its lifetime. GlaxoSmithKline, but originally started off as infant formula, and W.H. Smith. I'm very proud to say that the recent reorganization and sell-off in W.H. Smith is in the book, although it only happened 4 weeks before publication. The 8 of them have disappeared completely. 20 of them exist only as brands. And if you look at someone like Hovis, it's been owned by 7 different private equity companies in the last 30 years. It's tossed around like a toy, as private equity tended to do. So, I have lots of other thoughts I'd love to lay on you, but I think I probably have my 7 minutes by now.
Well, this is great. But before I ask John to speak, I mean, there are some issues. I mean, you talked about those companies that have survived, if I understand this correctly, that they have a number of characteristics, which is what I was mentioning at the beginning. So they seem to be sensitive to their environment, although you talked about environment not really from the way that we describe it now, not that type of environment that you were talking about. They were more aware of social change and so on that was going on. They were cohesive with a strong sense of identity, is what you have. They value their employees. They were tolerant. They were open to change. And the interesting thing is that they were conservatively financed. But as you explained yourself, a number of them, the way that they moved through the decades, became owned by hedge funds and others. So that seemed to have changed. But what it meant is that they employed low-risk financial strategies, and that, of course, kept them going because of that. But also the way in which they were involved in providing schools and providing, as I read through the details of some of the companies, and I was really very impressed with what they were doing, and also medical support. That was all before all that became available by the state. So we can't expect a lot of that to become. And the interesting thing for me is, because I looked a lot at Eastern Europe as well, and what they were doing in where, particularly after the fall of the wall, in the Berlin Wall, the way that they were managed and how these things then became extinct, really, and caused a lot of problem in society as they adapted to something different, is that loads of big firms, even though they were state-owned, of course, provided all that with them. The schools were there, houses for the employees, hospitals attached to big industrial works, So in a way, the environment has changed. And
Yeah.
do therefore these characteristics that you just mentioned still stand to this day, in your view?
I believe they do, because I think if I can use one phrase to sum up all of the things you just mentioned, it's taking a long-term perspective. And of course, in a family business, it was all about passing the company on to my son in 25 years' time in a better state than I inherited it. So there's a long-term perspective built in. But if you're going to build a village for your employees, then you need a long-term perspective. And again, this is the business about investment. Even in the middle of the 19th century, over half of all company investment was from accrued profit from sales. Banks were very, very small. It was only really when the railways came along that shareholding became significant, because railways needed a level of capital investment which banks and families between them couldn't afford. So it had to be spread out. But even then, and even, I remember my grandparents had shares in companies, but they weren't for selling. They were savings bonds, if you like. And some companies, again, Hartley's Jam did this to a large extent, offered savings schemes to their communities and paid better rates of interest than the banks did. So yes, I think it's all about long-term perspectives.
Yeah.
But remember, they pretty well weren't paying tax in the 19th century, and there was no public sector infrastructure to speak of. So if you wanted a loyal workforce behoven to you, on your doorstep, feeling valued and therefore productive, you built a village for them.
Yes, no, indeed. And the other thing, before I pass on to John, is that you approve, and I think the original book approved as well, of the passing of the companies, or involving the children, particularly boys, but occasionally the odd wife, widow, or whatever. And there is, I found it quite interesting. Said, I think you say somewhere that it was actually, a good thing to pass them, and then maybe even split the companies a bit in order to encourage a bit of innovation to take place. But of course, there was the problem that in many cases there were so many children. I think you mentioned one, a lady anyway, who had 18 of them. So I found it quite incomprehensible, having had a certain number myself that you could. But it actually wasn't a bad thing. Whereas now, there is a lot of it's all frowned upon. If the expectation is the second or third generation inheritance, if you like, of a company leads to its demise, which I don't think is substantiated by this. Is that right?
Well, I think that there were demographical changes, obviously, and the number of children went down. As the family got richer, it wasn't necessarily necessary for all of the children to get involved in the company.
Well, also, not all of them survived. I mean, that was the other
Not
thing.
all survived.
Very few survived, yes.
Absolutely. And I can't think of an example, but there were some where the majority of children died amongst them. So women were basically bringing up children, many of whom were not going to live to adulthood. Having said that, there were some fantastic women: Florence Boot, Christina Hartley, and the Coleman family had a couple. Elizabeth Cadbury, a liberal who was said by some to be the mother of Christian socialism. Yes, there were some fantastic women, and there were some left-wing politicians as well, as Josiah Wedgwood, the fourth. Who was first of a Liberal MP and then a Labour MP in Lord. And there was Julius Elias from Oddams, who was the first leader of the Labour group in the House of Lords in 1945.
And I think this is really interesting. You should. I mean, for those who don't have the book yet, there is a very nice chart showing the different companies and how long the families actually were leading. And for how many decades they were all leading it, and the generations, which I think is absolutely great. That's figure 3, page 28.
I don't think I necessarily said that retaining the family structure was a good thing. I'm saying it just happened, and it was the obvious thing to do at that time. But when you got levels of diversity of management and experience in finance and things like that, which the family didn't have. And that happened as the families got smaller. Then clearly you had to go outside.
Yeah.
I mean, there's another figure in the book which shows the rise and fall of the family company, and it's straight up and then straight down again.
Yes.
1890s, 30 of these companies were owned by families, but 30 years either side of that, it was only half that number.
Very interesting. Well, thank you very much. I mean, it's a fascinating book. So, John, if I can turn to you, John Kay, and get some reactions, I mean, and how it links with your book. That would be interesting to hear if it does.
I think it links very clearly to my book. And one of the things I like about this book is that it tells a story of how business has evolved through the story of individual companies, which I try to do to some degree in my corporation in the 21st century. But Tom does it on a much more extensive and larger scale in this book. And it is extraordinary that if I were to pick some of the textbooks on industrial organization from my shelf and look at the index, I would find it hard to find more than 2 or 3 firms actually listed in the index. That is, companies are about models and production functions and so on, but actually they're about people and capabilities. And my key message really is that they're about people and capabilities. And one of the, you've just been talking with Tom about the longevity or otherwise of firms. And I think that's a critical thing for us to understand and realize that the source of longevity has really been understanding what your competitive advantage is and adapting the application of that competitive advantage, your capabilities, to changing environments. And that was really brought home to me last week when I was on another event talking, and the person concerned, it was actually a conference organized by a bank which has existed for more than the best part of 2 centuries. And I was talking with a CEO of a company which has also existed for about 2 centuries. And the CEO was explaining at great length how they were now taking a long-term perspective on total shareholder return. And they actually had total shareholder return incentive plans, some of which actually ran for more than 5 years. There are very few companies that have incentive plans that run for more than 5 years. But we were at that event in the presence of companies which had very much longer time horizons for that. And we need to think about and understand why. And for me, that is about understanding that companies are collections of capabilities and succeed by applying them in different ways at different times. Now, it's also relevant since we last talked on Radix, Vicky, that Alistair McIntyre died. And in Alistair McIntyre, for me, is probably the philosopher who had most impact on what I actually think about business. To say that seems a bit strange, because McIntyre was actually extremely hostile to modern business. Indeed, his background for many years was that he was a left-wing, indeed even Marxist person, and his books have a fair amount of vitriol about business. But the essence of McIntyre was that he was taken up with virtue ethics, and he believed, as I now believe, that virtue ethics is the methodology, philosophical methodology, most relevant to ethical businesses, to ethics and business. And Tom has just talked about that. He talked about what Nestle was doing in South Africa, which is what we mean there. And if there's a couple of pages that McIntyre wrote, that had more impact on me than anything. It's when he asks the question, what do we mean by a good knife? And now a good knife is a good knife which is good at doing the kind of things which knives are made and expected to do. And he lists some of the criteria which that would imply. Now that's very different from people who've been brought up in the, well, it dates back to Hume really, the philosophical tradition that says a good has very different meanings in ethics and in practical matters like knife. You know, a good knife is not a virtuous knife, but actually in the virtue ethics framework, a good knife is a virtuous knife. Or that is what we mean by virtue in this context. And similarly, a good business is one which is good at doing the kind of things we want business to do. And we want business to produce goods that goods and services that consumers want. We want businesses to be places that people like to work and feel proud to work. We want businesses to make returns for investors. We want businesses to enhance the communities in which they operate. And that is pretty much the attitude which some of the founders or early developers of these businesses, which Tom talked about in his book, took. They may not have read much in the way of Aristotelian virtue ethics, but they had understood the ideas which were being put forward there. And I've been very clear since I started thinking about that of the three main, as it were, schools of ethical schools in modern philosophy, the utilitarian, the deontological, which comes up with Kantian type rules, do as you would be done by, etc., and the virtue ethics, which says that what we're trying to do is create businesses that are good at doing the kind of things we want business to do.
Of course, but John, I mean, one of the questions asked, of course, is precisely that. Since they don't do it, for both the question for you and for Tom, and one of the questions from Robert Shaw into this group is, what institutional reforms would we recommend to ensure that actually firms do align their corporate success or the way they view it with long-term social environmental well-being? I mean, as you said, John, a lot of the compensation is sort of short-term, 5 years at most. Sometimes it's 10, but usually it's 5, and sometimes even shorter than that. And that is despite the fact, as Tom is saying in his book, that the arrangements, the governance arrangements for the companies we'll be looking at in his book, which of course he starts looking at them from the Victorian era up to now. They were very different to where we are. They lacked accountability, as Tom is saying, diversity, reporting lines. They lacked sort of proper systems of delegation, and yet they did all this. Now we have put all these extra things around companies, and they don't do it. So what do we learn from this? What more do we need to do?
Vicky, this comes to what for me is the key issue, because we've called a lot of this stuff in relation to companies ethics from ESG type perspectives. For me, ethics is doing things in the business well. The ethics of business is about creating great businesses. And great businesses, as I describe, are businesses that have satisfied customers who are getting goods and services at reasonable prices. They have employees who are proud to work there. They have investors who are earning a good return. And all of that is true in the long run. And what the most successful of the people in Tom's book actually did was they set out to create great businesses. Now, this is not about you make a lot of money and you have an ethics department that produces glossy brochures that show how ethical you are. I may have told you the story before, which certainly influenced me. When we talk about the collapse of ICI as Britain's leading industrial company of the 20th century. I've talked quite often about that decline. But one occasion was in 2006, just before ICI finally disappeared. And I talked about the decline of ICI. And a few days later, I got a paying letter from ICI's Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility. And what it said was, we might have screwed up the business, but we did a great job on corporate social responsibility.
I'm going to tell you, John and Tom, that when I started setting up a company called Good Corporation, we went to Enron in Texas, and we had a fantastic presentation on their CSR activities. Amazing. And I thought, well, they don't need any support then, that's fine. 3 weeks later, they were gone because of the nasty things they were doing. But if I can then also ask Tom to respond to, because basically we've answered, I think, John, you've already sort of answered a lot of the questions in the chat about, how capitalism can be reformed or not, or what the issues are. So Tom, in terms of anything from the center that might, from government that can have an impact, and then we'll open it up.
I was reminded by John's comments of the etymology of the word company. It's people who break bread together. So it is a family, if not the family, company with bread. So that essence was there right from the beginning, I think. I have a feeling, I'm not sure I put this in words in the book, but I have a feeling that we've passed the worst in terms of the disengaged company. I think that probably the 30, 40 years from the 1960s, and I currently work in a business school, and let me say that from the 1960s onwards, I think business schools were poisoning the water in terms of bringing in the sort of Friedmanite ethos, which was almost universal globally in the rapid growth of business schools, which basically said the riches are here for you to take. All you have to do is to run a business, and you can be as rich as Croesus. I'm also reminded, of course, that what's going on at the same time as the Cold War, so trying to paint the American economy in particular as being profits available for you just to come and help yourself if you join the business community sort of thing. I think that has changed. I'll give you an example of how that's changed. There's a company that's been in the news this week. 10 years ago, KKR was a private equity company, was involved in the takeover of Boots. That involved putting billions of dollars of debt onto the Boots balance, which meant effectively Boots would never have to pay tax again because it could always offset that against losses. This week, KKR has stepped back from. KKR is a strong investor in solar and wind power in America. It's one of the biggest, which has surprised me when I found out, because when they were sort of at the height of the private equity era, that they were amongst the most rapacious. But I have friends now who work in private equity and say we're doing that with a social conscience and we're delivering good things. And I think that's partly because expectations are higher, partly because reporting requirements on those issues are better, and because thanks to the internet and so on, transparency is greater. And coming to what you were saying about CSR, an awful lot of what passed the CSR in the past was fairly mythical and fairly transient and shallow. But you can't get away with scrimping on social purpose, with saying you're doing social purpose and not delivering it. You can't get away with that anymore.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether KK are necessarily associated with social purpose, but of course, I mean, they were, but they've been in the news because they're not supporting. They not can get Thames Water out of trouble.
Well, they pulled out of Thames Water.
Yeah,
I think the one group of people that Thames Water does not need is KKR. I mean, it needs people who are interested, again, to go back to running a good business, which would be a good business, that produced clean and cheap water for the people of London. And that's what that business is or should be about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
what has failed in Thames Water is a Friedmanite type of game in which the idea is if we set up a set of rules, then if the rules are sufficiently clever, people will be induced by that to run the business in the public interest. That's the experiment which has essentially failed.
Yeah.
And if you look at the amount paid in bonuses in the last 10 years, whatever, and the amount of debt the company's written up in that time, those figures are about equal. Funny that, isn't it?
I mean,
Yeah.
the bonuses fiasco in the last couple of weeks,
Yeah,
sort of almost passes belief. If I might add an anecdote on your observation about business schools, I remember getting the then retired CEO of one of the companies mentioned in your book to talk to a class of mine at LBS, London Business School. And at the end of it, he said to me quietly, you know, these kids regard being CEO as a prize, not a responsibility.
yes.
And that's
Absolutely.
the essence of the change.
Yeah.
Which had occurred.
Okay.
I do think
Well,
business have changed and are changing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's all, you know, it is actually rather depressing, really, and that is reflected very much in the chat and the questions that have been asked. But before I open it up, I mean, what is interesting in terms of all these companies, not having been brought up here, quite a lot of things I didn't know, but all the things that I take for granted were, you know, Coleman's, Mustard, and Price's Candles. I hadn't actually realized that in all those cases, well, in the majority of the cases of the companies that you looked at, it's the names of the founders.
Yes.
And the family that those are, which I think is really, really interesting that they have survived and those names are still there and they're so important as part of the culture. Okay, we'll open it up. We don't have huge amount of time, but because having two people speaking, but so well interlinked, which I think is brilliant, it leaves us with a little bit less time. So who would like to ask a question from everyone? Yeah, and you can all, if you wanted, as I said, unmute, put your hand up. And it's entirely possible because I'm finding myself in this unusual location that I may be missing all you people wanting to ask a question. Now, come on. Otherwise, I will carry on from the ones that had been pre-sent. Looking to see, and if anyone else spots them. Any questions directly to our two speakers? Well, hopefully you will get encouraged to do that, but you have been putting them in the chat, though. I have to say, I mean, I think that's probably for John. There is a question about capitalism is almost value-free. So because of the way that it has developed, whereas, you know, in the past, the question is, you had land for farming and the hunter-gatherers, and now you've got everyone moving into just being owners of capital, and that has separated them from the means of production and employees in a way, and therefore it has led to this. I don't know whether, Tom, you think that is the case, looking at all these businesses, the separation, if you like, from really being part of what was being produced and done all around you, and the fact that now businesses just own all that capital. As John Kay was saying, what you actually own, or at least a firm, is just made up of all the people's that you're employing sort of capabilities, and if they all disappear, then you can't actually carry on. But do you think that this is the reason, Tom, why there's been this change in attitude as well, in terms of being socially interested as a company, that this division of capital? We just talked about KKR and others. Is that the problem?
I think if one of the, well, I think they're all interesting, but the interesting case of Bass breweries, if you look in there, they grew for 150 years, from 1770 until the 1920s and 30s. And they were the world's biggest brewer. And obviously India Pale Ale didn't get its name without a good reason. They were supplying the Raj and so on. But you will see the red triangle, Britain's first registered trademark, on Toulouse-Lautrec's painting, and on various bottles made by various brewers today. But Bass themselves own only the name. They do not own any of the breweries anymore. They don't make beer. They're better known these days in intercontinental hotels. And I think they had a crisis, which was due to growth by acquisition. There was a man called John Gretton, who was the first non-family CEO, chairman of the company, who went out and bought every brewery in sight for about 30 years. I think it just led to an unstable mountain of breweries which didn't have a common identity, which quite possibly back in those days didn't have common working methods and so on. And it led to the situation where in the 1980s, you got the three big breweries, and Mrs. Thatcher's government brought in the beer orders to stop the monopoly exploitation of the beer market. But Bass had already pretty well gone by then, and although last year William Bass was voted the world's best ever brewer, his heritage has got precious little to do with brewing, and that's because the nature of the company had changed, and the purpose of the company had been completely lost because of their particular commitment to growth by an inherently unstable method of acquisition.
There's an interesting story there, which is the largest brewer in the world now is, of course, AB InBev.
Yeah.
And that is a story of a private equity firm acquiring aggressively across a range of Western countries. And interestingly, it looks as if that operation has taken as a whole not been successful. And the attempt to apply similar methods to craft wines and so on has also failed. That in a fast-moving consumer goods market, despite the fast-moving observation, you can have the idea, you can monetize the accumulated goodwill of the brand, and private equity operators have believed they can do that and have not been very successful in extracting money in doing so. Indeed, what we're seeing in private equity across a whole range of industries at the moment, it's the vet story or the pharmacist story or whatever, is a similar attempt to monetize goodwill in a relatively short period of time. And
exit, and then exit, I suppose.
Then exit, yes. And since we will go on wanting vets and pharmacists, this is not a good story from a public policy perspective.
Well, I mean, this brings us back then to another question that just appeared, which is, which companies from here on will be still around in 20 years' time? And I think one of the points made by Alex Murdoch is in the chat is that there was I think you talked about that one, John. I think Peters and Wehrman, a book. I think you may have mentioned that in the previous chat we had. Yes, In Search of Excellence, which and quite rightly, sort of 20 years later, the companies that had been featured in that have gone. So what is excellent these days, John? Perhaps.
Excellence is knowing what your competitive advantages are and applying them in different areas. It's quite interesting. I'm just doing some writing about the history of the basically mobile internet technology. And it's interesting how long the list of failures is, that there are so many companies that were once the future and either are no longer around or are no longer important. When we talk about the Magnificent Seven at the moment, I asked the question, what would you have chosen as your Magnificent Seven in 2000? And the answer was, in 2000, Cisco was the most valuable company in the world. And it's still there, but your shares would be worth round about what that you would have paid for them in 2000. So that developing businesses is about understanding your competitive advantages and applying them to changing operations. And that's what the survivors in the mobile technology area, Apple and Microsoft, have done relatively well. And Apple, interestingly, well, both these companies nearly failed at substantial times doing that, and in the end pulled it round by understanding what their competitive advantages were. That's, for me, the key.
Yes, but yeah, it's interesting though that in that the social aspect isn't there unless you think that this is part of their competitive advantage in terms of how people view it. Because what people may think, and I've seen the loads of questions in the chat, is that we've moved to monopolies where competition isn't there necessarily, and where those returns just come to just a few big firms, and that's which look mainly at increasing. When we look at the big tech ones, increasing their share values rather than anything else. So of course you can look at competitiveness, but do we value all the other things that Tom has been talking about, you were talking about as well, John, in the valuations of firms?
I don't agree with the underlying proposition.
Oh, okay.
I've no doubt that the people at Apple and Microsoft wanted to build great businesses, and that was their primary motivation. It was not making lots of money for their shareholders. They did make money for their shareholders, but that was incidental. That wasn't primarily what it was about. And that's what building great, not just building great companies, but companies that generate large amounts of money for shareholders is about. I think I used, when we talked last, the score takes care of itself observation, which was an American football coach, a legendary one, describing how he operated. If you build a great team, the score takes care of itself. That's the key. It's not how are we going to win. And you can see that how are we going to win takes you down different rules.
Yes, I agree. Tom, do you want to come into this?
Yes, I was very pleased just a couple of days ago to see a new report out by Unilever looking at its ESG achievements, this year's report that's out. And this is 5 years after the end of their Sustainable Development Programme, which you recall Paul Pullman brought in. And if I could just give you a quote, you asked about the long-term future. The companies that will be written about in another century will be the ones that embrace their purpose, giving back more than they take, rejecting business as usual. Those that don't will be consigned to the graveyard of dinosaurs. And Paul Pullman then goes on to say, CEOs would be wise to reflect upon the lessons in this book. So sorry, couldn't help resist putting that one in. But you have a company there, and I remember I got to know Paul at about the time when they were fighting off the Kraft Heinz takeover, and they succeeded in fighting it off, which I think a lot of people thought that they wouldn't be able to do. But you have there a company which is delivering social purpose, and it's doing it throughout the world in some of our poorest communities. And I think that's an example that will be attractive to others if they are genuinely looking for long-term sustainability.
Right, I think John, did you not cover Unilever in your talk as well? Or am I imagining it?
And I'm slightly reluctant to do that. There's this quote which is often attributed to Milton Friedman, which is the business of business is business. And Friedman, as far as I can find, never said that.
No,
and
not
do I not say it, but I don't think he would have said it, because for me the point is that the business of business is business. The business of business is not making as much money as possible. The business
is doing a good knife. It's producing a good knife.
Job. Yeah.
No, you're right. Well, so there is a question from Ben Rich saying, so which company? Is it one company which is massive today, which will be gone in 20 years' time? Or probably there's loads of them. One could think.
I'm just asking for an example. Go for it. I want to. I want their predictions.
We've already mentioned
Well,
Thames Water.
I'm waiting with bated breath, and we can all go and buy
I
shares.
can predict Thames Water, one I might not be so able to predict.
Yeah, Thames Water will still be around, that's for sure.
In a different guise.
And it will be still around because the things people need from Thames Water, they will continue to need. And the issue there, which is quite a general issue, is how do we find, in terms of both running the business and governing the business, the best means of doing that. But I don't want to say if you buy stock X in 20 years' time, you will be the world's richest man.
So any predictions, Tom, on which company might still be around in 20 years' time, which is massive now, will still be there? There was a question also about, do we really believe that Unilever is a model of ethical and purposeful
My question was which ones will have gone rather than.
which
So
ones?
I'm not.
Which ones will
I'm
have
not
gone?
asking. I'm not asking for stock
will be
tips.
gone. Oh God.
I'm asking for who should I dump?
Oh damn! They would have
Well,
been quite
Vicky,
interesting in the other.
in your introduction, you mentioned that I helped to found Fair for You, which is an ethical social enterprise lender helping people who can't otherwise afford the credit to get things like washing machines. 10 years ago, we set out. We said we would know we were being successful when we put Bright House out of business, and Bright House has gone out of business. So I'm delighted with that. But I think it would be wholly irresponsible for us to set a run on the shares of other companies by trying to say now where they will be in 20 years' time in terms of failure or not.
But I'm pretty sure, and this was part of my point of looking back to 2000, that not all of the Magnificent Seven will be large and successful companies in 20 years' time.
Well, I mean, the Magnificent. So where we're talking about oil now, where we're talking about something else.
The Magnificent Seven are not oil companies; they're Nvidia,
the tech firms,
yeah,
right?
high tech, yeah.
Because of course it was the Seven Sisters before. We all thought that they weren't going to survive either, and here they still are. Basically, that's an interesting one because I used to work for one of them. That's not why they survived, but we think that you can't carry on like that, and yet they do, which is interesting because they do accumulate a lot of power, and then they eliminate a lot of competition. No, are we not worried about that? So I was just wondering really whether, again, thinking about the premise of what John, I think you've mentioned the looking at your competitive advantage, if you like, but do we eliminate? Is eliminating competition or encouraging more? I mean, which way does it actually work in terms of encouraging the social values to be still prominent in what one does?
I don't think there's anything wrong with healthy competition, and I wouldn't advocate that we had giant monoliths in each sector of the economy. Because competition does stimulate innovation, and innovation stimulates growth, and so on. So I wouldn't want that to happen. But I'm thinking back, in the past, the one example, a company I'd never heard of when I started to do this was Moody's Circulating Library. Which went out of business in 1937. But essentially, along with the publishers who I talk about in the book, they were building on the 1870 Education Act, and they were looking out to an audience of a literate audience for the first time, people who wanted to read for pleasure and entertainment. And it wasn't the public library system which competed Moody out of business so much as Carnegie. And the Carnegie libraries, because he provided 600 libraries in this country, and this again highlights that moral dilemma. The 600 libraries that Andrew Carnegie produced were provided on because he could afford to do that because of his huge wealth, which he'd acquired through paying poverty wages and shooting strikers.
Well, that's interesting. But I think I think Ray Anderson had been asking that question of Unilever. Do you want to say whether you got your answers or not, or is Ray there? He's muted. Ray Anderson had asked the question. If you wanted to elaborate, oh, there you are. Hi. Did you want to just talk a little bit about your question, and whether, which companies we can consider to be virtuous and which ones not, from the experience that we've had so far? Are you there, Ray?
Ray is standing on a train, he says, so perhaps
Oh my
he's
goodness.
restraining himself.
Oh right, okay. If suddenly you get a better position on the train, do unmute yourself, although we're running towards the end. And Robin, you had undone your screen for a second. Robin Stafford, do you want to come back? Robin, maybe he's standing on a train as well. So Robin, anyway, I thought he did come on and then disappeared. So I think we're having some connection problems with a number of people. And we just got a message from Ray to say there's a lot of noise where he's standing on the train. So that's absolutely fine. So I think that happens quite a bit. Okay, so we're getting near the end. The main reason we know that is because Ben has appeared, like Deus Ex Machina. So any final thoughts, both John and Tom? Perhaps I'll have quickly John, and then Tom can finish it off. John?
Let me just say, having introduced the word virtue into this discussion, you repeated it.
Yeah, it was Ray who mentioned Ray
virtue
Anderson.
for me
Yeah.
in a company.
Yeah.
It's not publishing a brochure on what a great job we're doing on corporate social responsibility. The brochure we've all seen from many companies with pictures of ethnic minorities, people in wheelchairs, and printed on recycled paper. It's building a great business. That's what I mean by virtue.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Tom?
I think it's so important not to give way to prejudices and to initial perceptions. I mean, as I've mentioned, Nestle was an inspiration to me nearly 20 years ago with the work that they were doing, work they weren't shouting about. And of course, in this country in particular, they had and still have a not very good reputation based on things they were actually stopped doing 40 years ago. But then when I became a consultant, one of my first clients was Serco, and I was doing what I thought was some magnificent work with them. Unfortunately, they then fell foul of public opinion. But what I was looking at there was the way they delivered their purpose through partnerships with charities. And I used to find there were two sorts of charities. There were charities that had never worked with Serco who were very critical, and there were charities who had worked with Serco who thought they were the best thing since sliced bread.
Interesting.
First appearances can be deceiving, but I think people are learning, companies are learning that being responsible in whatever, however you care to define that, would certainly include being sustainable, is actually the way to get people on your side and to carve out a future. Because if we're not responsible, then that future lies ahead of us is going to be much more dark than it otherwise would be.
Well, thank you, and thank you both, Tom and John. And I have to say that the more I think of it, the more I think these two books are very much aligned with each other. And thank you for being prepared to share this hour between you. And thank you for all who've joined, and also, of course, to Sophie and Georgie for making this possible, and Ben, of course, for directing it all, if you like, in terms of making it happen. But you've all been incredibly shy today. I don't know whether it is indeed problems of, just come back from half term or something like that, or it is problems with connections, being on trains, as we said. So, but it is great to see so many of you, and thank you very, very much for taking part. And you can, at some point, I think Ben will encourage you to, if you want, to those who do, to unmute yourselves and show your appreciation. But Ben, closing remarks from you.
Thank you, Vicky. A really sort of interesting conversation. I did sort of feel that I needed a glass of wine, and as if I was sitting around the dinner table. And I don't know, but certainly for myself, I was just enjoying hearing you talk, which was why I wasn't coming forward with questions. I hope everybody's enjoying it. If you have, then our next session is Monday, the 23rd of June, and I'm delighted to say we've got David Peretz and Professor Andrew Lambert talking about Britain's future relationship with China. And we did this, a similar discussion about 4 years ago. And I feel that is definitely worth revisiting. And what I'm actually going to do is repost that conversation before we start advertising this, because it seems to me that we will find that things have moved on a very long way. So I do hope people will join us for that. I want to thank Tom and John, myself, and urge you to buy their books. I'm going to have a look out for Tom's book. I bought John's last time we did it, but I'm very interested, Tom. I think it's fascinating, and just that list of companies that you talk about in the books is really fascinating. For the price of a pint of Bass, you can help us to organise these sessions. Please do go on our website, have a look at whether you would like to make a donation. It's just in the top right-hand corner, and yeah, a £5 or a tenner would be very much appreciated if you think you've had a good evening's entertainment. Thank you again. Thank you to Vicky for chairing wonderfully as ever, and I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you very much, and by all means, unmute and wave goodbye.
Yes, some people have waved while they were still hiding, but this is great. So, and others have sent their appreciation in the chat. So, thank you all.
Tom, John, really, really interesting. Actually, it took me some time to work out that the two books belong together, but I think the discussion really does show that they do, not that they're necessarily arguing the same things, but they provide the latest story as well as the earlier story. It's great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye, and thank you.
I'm going to say goodbye. Cheers.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.